Okay, we're going to go back and do a different thing because we're missing Marjorie. And so here it is. This is a little foray into late 19th century, early 20th century science. And it's based on a book called Occult Chemistry that was written by two people, Annie Besant, who's shown here, and Charles Leadbeater, who's shown here. And they were very active in the Theosophical Society for many years. So I'm going to go through their backgrounds and then what they did on occult chemistry, and it'll lead into how I even got involved in doing this stuff. So here we go. In December of 2015, I was doing my usual browsing on the internet, and I came across a reference to a book called Occult Chemistry. It was published, initially it was published in a journal, in a publication in London, and starting in 1895, but they put them all together in 1908. And the book is available free on the web as an Acrobat file called Occult Chemistry. And they purported to carry out observations of all the natural elements in the periodic table. But more importantly, they looked at what are called isotopes. Isotopes were unknown at that point in time, which was amazing, I thought. So then I did some additional running around on the web, and I discovered that a nuclear particle theoretical physicist in England, Stephen Phillips, had also come across this work in the late 1970s, and he carried out a variety of investigations and concluded that what they did actually had some scientific merit. And in doing this, I came across a reference to Ronald Cowan, and he had independently duplicated these observations of Besant and Leadbeater in the early 1990s. And he interacted with Phillips, and Phillips came over to Toronto from England and visited him. And he spent a lot of time with Ron and Stephen duplicating the observations of Besant and Leadbeater. And so,
yeah, I met him.
Yeah, and you met him.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the ultimate issues in science is always one good observation kills 1,000 theories. So
right.
Here you have Besant and Leadbeater, who themselves are making these observations, and then Ron is independently confirming them. And it's interesting, as we'll see. Ron, Besant and Leadbeater, when they looked at an element of some sort, say hydrogen, just as an example, you never have really free hydrogen that is a single proton with an electron running around it. It's highly reactive to everything around you. And so typically the hydrogen will bind with another hydrogen atom, and you'll always see a pair of hydrogen atoms. And so what Besant and Leadbeater did in their observations, which are all done under intense meditation, just like what Ron Cowan did, was they always looked at these pairings of everything, every single element, not just hydrogen or helium, but every single element, they paired them up, which Ron didn't have that problem. He could look at a single hydrogen atom, he could look at a single helium atom, and so forth. So there's something very different about how Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater carried out their observations under meditation and what Ron did. But they came up with the same results. It has that quirk to it. So what happened here was I began to collaborate with Ron from 2016 until he passed on in 2019. And that's where I learned that Stephen Phillips had visited Ron. Ron told Stephen that he could independently duplicate the observations of Leadbeater and Besant and so forth. And so that's really where this class came from, was this original, rummaging around on the web, and this is what I came up with. So here's what they wrote a book called Occult Chemistry, and the subtitle is Investigations by Clairvoyant Magnification into the Structure of the Atoms of the Periodic Table and Some Compounds. And they ended up having it published in, I think 1908 was the actual publication, but the different chapters in the book were published along the way, starting in 1895. So the thing that comes across, of course, is that this is like crazy, like what's going on here. How could you go into deep meditation and be able to do anything like what they're talking about? But as we'll see here, we're just going to skip ahead here, so you'll see. There's still a bunch of academic criticism out there on what they did. And you have to remember that science is ultimately a social process, that the criticism that's cited here, when all is said and done, in my opinion, is false. And in the opinion of Stephen Phillips is false, and many other people. And it reflects in a lot of personal biases and a very shallow review of the facts that were presented, and they miss really key points along the way. So I'm absolutely convinced this is correct. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind is the time in which they're doing this. People have long felt that Democritus was correct, that everything was made up of atoms, but it was becoming clear that maybe atoms themselves were made up of smaller things. And just around 1895, the electron was discovered, which had to be part of the atom. And what there were various suggestions for what the atom would look like, but it wasn't until 1912, 1913 that there were experiments done that showed that most atoms are empty. The space around them is a cloud of electrons, but that's really hardly anything. And most of the mass of the atom is in its nucleus, which is made up of these two particles, protons and neutrons. Protons have a positive charge, which is equal to the negative charge on an electron, and neutrons have no charge. So no one knew this, except that Leadbeater and Besant, when they carried their observations out, that's exactly what they saw. But they had a framework to try and interpret what was going on, because they had the periodic table of elements, and they knew that there were things called atoms, and so they ended up pursuing this within this framework. But other people, there's undoubtedly many other people that have discovered what Leadbeater and Besant saw, but they if you don't have a framework to put the observations in, you just go, that's pretty, I wonder what's going on. I don't have a clue. And a lot of these things, again, are metaphors. They give you a picture of what's going on. So the picture of an atom is this cloud of electrons with a nucleus there. But to put it into perspective, just so you'd understand, if the cloud of electrons was the size of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, then the nucleus, which is where the bulk of the mass is, with the protons and neutrons, would be the size of the chalice on the main altar. So you can see it's mostly empty space, okay? And it'd be possible to even miss, this nucleus, because if you're looking around, you might not see it. So the other thing is that this is happening as there's a transition here from alchemy to what is called modern chemistry, modern physics, and so forth. And there really isn't a lot of solid writings on alchemy, other than we know that Newton spent far more time on alchemy than he did on gravitation or on calculus. It was the one subject he spent a huge amount of time on, but we have no idea what he did. So if Newton thought there was something there, there's probably something there. Anyway, that's what we're faced with. And there were a lot of, I'll just call them occult circles. They're groups of people that are slightly, they're open-minded to things, but sometimes they end up getting carried away with ideas that don't seem to make any sense. And that's the nature of the time that are there. So let's go back to Leadbeater and Besant. So in August of 1895, a group of these people from the Theosophical Society gathered for a weekend in Surrey, and while they were there, they got into intense meditation, and this gave them clairvoyance, the ability to see. Clairvoyant means to see clearly, so to go down into the microcosm, which is what they did, involving direct observations of atoms, or to go out into the macrocosm, to go out into the far reaches of space. Ron Cowan did both of these things. So the question is, how did they do this? Well, they went through this meditation, and then, typically someone like Ron would look like at a button on his shirt, and he'd focus on the button and drill down into the button, and he would go down smaller and smaller in size until he got down to the scale of the atom itself, making up the button with electrons and the nuclei there. This is what a lot of people, find hard to believe. Like, how could you possibly do this just with your head? And here we have, for example, these high energy physicists that build these accelerators, and they have thousands, tens of thousands of PhDs, billions, tens of billions of dollars, and they can't remotely do anything like this. It's not even close. And all I would say is, not everybody is Michael Jordan at basketball. So some people can do this and some people can't. And if you don't think you can do it, you probably won't do it. But for whatever reason, Ron felt he could do this, and he did, just like Leadbeater and Besant felt they could. The other thing about this is Leadbeater left the Anglican Church, but it's really Annie Besant who's the heavyweight here. After she illegally separated from her husband and they had a child, she renounced her faith, Christian faith, and joined the company of radicals and atheists and so forth. And they collaborated in writing a pamphlet which set down in plain non-medical language advice for ordinary women about contraception and birth control. And so she became a public speaker and writer who outraged polite bourgeois society with her forthright free thinking and atheistic opinions, and all the more so because she was a woman saying this, okay? So she published a bunch of things like this, and what happened, she was very eloquent, and so the young writer and playwright George Bernard Shaw introduced her to his socialist friends. However, her colleague was criticized and disowned her for not making this move into socialism, and her estranged husband surfaced trying to get legal control of her daughter, and she lost her daughter, which really threw her for a loop. But what happened was she came out of this the stronger, and a few months before all these Jack the Ripper murders were taking place in London, she took up the cause of young girls working at a matchbox company in the East End of London, and she began to expose the appalling working conditions there, which led to a strike that was soon vindicated. There was an independent inquiry, and the working conditions were terrible. And so the directors looked into what was going on, and everyone went out on strike for a couple of days, and there was a promise to improve everything. And this was the first time there'd been a strike by unskilled workers, and there was no union in place. Okay, that's who she was. She was able to pull something off like this and to get a lot of publicity for it, to expose what was really bad there. So, and she was a woman. That was the other thing that bothered all these men. She spent a lot of time championing the rights of poor and working people, and became very well known. But she felt that something more than the socialist movement was needed to establish the true brotherhood of man. And what happened was, in 1889, she was asked to review a book called The Secret Doctrine. It was written by a Russian woman, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And this incredible work here purported to demonstrate the existence of ancient esoteric wisdom linking all the religious mythologies and handed down by initiates in both the East and the West, all around the world. Blavatsky traveled the whole globe. And so all of a sudden, Annie Besant jumped onto this, and she said, this is the right movement. This is what I've been searching for. And what Blavatsky called it Theosophy. I'm gonna really jump into this. So she joined this, and Blavatsky was the first president. She became the second president in 1907. And she wrote many books, and she was quite eloquent, giving public lectures all over the place in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But beyond that, just to show who she was, she led a reform campaign on behalf of Indians in India to establish the first national Hindu university in India. And she formed the Home Rule League for India in 1916, which led to her being put in jail. The British don't go for this. And then she was released after the vice president of the Theosophical Society smuggled a letter to President Wilson asking him to intercede with the British government to release her, which happened. So it just shows at what level she operated, that she could reach out to someone like President Wilson and got out of jail. She became president of the Indian National Congress, and both Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru later acknowledged their debt to her pioneering efforts. And Gandhi said that Besant awoke India from the deep sleep. And so there's a nice film about her life. So this is really truly an amazing woman. She has big footprints. Wherever she's gone, she's done things, and people have paid attention to her. Now, in 1894, she met Leadbeater, and the next year, Leadbeater and their Indian colleague, C.J. Jinarajadasa, ended up living in the London Theosophical headquarters off of Regent's Park. Madame Blavatsky had passed away in 1891, and this is now where Annie Besant was living. And these two people collaborated with a whole series of books until 1933. So this book, Occult Chemistry, is just one of these books. Besant and Leadbeater both professed to have received instruction in a certain type of yoga known as Kundalini yoga in order to develop certain psychic powers. They claim to have acquired the paranormal ability to see clairvoyantly way down into the microcosm, into small objects such as atoms. And this is one of the 8 siddhis, or psychic powers, that are mentioned in Hindu folklore, and also in all the great yogis and the sacred writings you find in India. So if we look in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he has in book 3 in chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutras. There's 195 sutras, and they're put into 4 books of roughly 50 each. And they're each 3 to 5 words of Sanskrit. So it was probably oral for millennia before this. And what happened was Patanjali described these siddhis by saying, in particular, the yogi can gain knowledge of the small, the hidden, or the distance by directing the light of a superphysical faculty. So again, what Ron Cowan would do is go into deep meditation and be able to drill down. In fact, I asked Ron to drill down to the quantized compartments of space that make up the foam that is the space all around us. And so this was far beyond, 15 orders of magnitude beyond what Annie Besant and Leadbeater had done. They could have done it, but it's not clear they would have known what they were seeing. But that Ron confirmed that space is in fact made up of these discrete compartments, and the compartments, the key thing he observed, the really fundamental thing is they're coated with blocks of information. So this is the most amazing computer system you've ever seen, and the blocks of information contain both the algorithms and the data, and they're constantly scanning the world around it and coming up with, if there's a change, then they'll check with the algorithms, and whatever the change is, the algorithms will tell them you have to do this. So that's how the universe works, and Ron observed all this. Here's a quotation out of the verse 26 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is Sanskrit up here, which you could transliterate, but what it says is that with great meditation, you can have knowledge of the small, the hidden, or the distant. Okay, you can go, you can see behind walls. You can see to the far reaches of the galaxies and so forth. There's a similar verse here, verse 44 of the Uttara Tantra, which is for Buddhists. The essence of Buddhahood at fruition has the qualities of clear cognition, jnana, and freedom from impurity. So the quality of clear cognition has 5 powers related to this. The first power of cognition is divine vision, which is the ability to see extremely distant and small things. So here we have 2 different spins on what's going on here to gather this. Now, the problem with this is that people like Ron Cowan are very good artists, and so they could take paper and pencil and do very good sketches of what they saw. Besant and Leadbeater did the same thing. They were apparently very good artists, and then when they published stuff in their books, they got a draftsman to create very high quality drawings. And so that's what we have. There'll be no photographs. There'll be no, flash pictures, no anything like that, because they're doing this just through meditation. So those that aren't familiar, the Uttara Tantra is a well-known Buddhist treatise, and we're going to skip over this. So one of the problems that people have with this is they say, okay, well, Leadbeater could have very well been psychic, but how in the world did Annie Besant become clairvoyant? Okay, and so she actually has a story that we're going to look at here. This is in a letter she wrote in July 1889, Fontainebleau, France, and she wrote this letter. She says, "I'll tell you about the first occasion in which I saw my master." Well, master is one of these spirits that Helena Blavatsky was talking about. Soon after I joined the Theosophical Society, it happened I was in England, and Helen Petrovna Blavatsky, HPV, was in Fontainebleau, where the Voice of the Silence was written. And so she wrote me to go over and join her. that you have to remember, this is back when you could write a letter in London and in the morning, and it would be delivered in the afternoon on the other side of London. The postal system was incredible. The same thing with Paris. So these letters zipped all over the place with the trains and so forth. So she wrote back and said she was going to join her, and they went off, and there was a nice house out in the country. She was put in a bedroom next to Helena Blavatsky with a door connecting the two. And then one night I awoke suddenly owing to an extraordinary feeling that there was in the room something. The air was throbbing. It seemed as if an electric machine was playing there. The whole room was electric. I would just say it's energetic. So, she used electric because that was all they were familiar with, but there's probably other forms of energy. And I was so astonished because it was the first experience that I sat up in bed and wondered what in the world was going on. And it was quite dark, and I wasn't really a clairvoyant at all at this point. This is 1889, and she started doing these observations in 1895. So years of training. But at the foot of the bed, she saw a luminous figure, quite dark, and it took me half a minute. The figure was there, maybe for a minute to half a minute, and then it disappeared. It was the figure of a very tall man, and it appeared from the pictures that I'd seen that it was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's master. Now, near him was another figure, more faintly luminous, which I could not clearly distinguish, and this brilliant figure stood quite still looking at me. I was so utterly astonished that astounded that I stood perfectly still, just looking at him, and he looked at me, and that was it. And then the end result was that he vanished. And so the next day I told Helena Petrovna Blavatsky what had happened, and she replied, "Oh yeah, my master came to see me in the night and went into your room to have a look at you." So this was my first experience of seeing a master, and it must have been a case of materialization, for as I have said, I was not in the least clairvoyant at the time. So this encouraged her to want to learn more about this. And so she went into deep meditation and was able to do all kinds of things. The other thing to know is that after 1913, Annie Besant stopped all of her clairvoyant work because she felt that the strain was so great, it was interfering with her political work in India, which you could see as incredible. And so skeptics deny that she possessed any psychic ability, but the problem is that when she reported the experiences in this letter, she said, in those days, I was not the least bit clairvoyant at the time. And so what she was saying was, therefore, later on, she became clairvoyant with working with Leadbeater. So the two of them began using what they called micro psi. So psi is a popular abbreviation. The Greek letter psi denotes mental, something mental, and micro means that they're using their thoughts to peer into the microcosm. And so they started examining what we saw as atoms, and they discovered that the atoms, in particular the protons and neutrons, were made up of what today we would call subquarks. So we have 3 subquarks equals 1 quark, 3 quarks equals either 1 proton or 1 neutron, but they're different sorts of quarks. And then we have an electron, we have a photon, and that pretty much covers what's going on. So rather than jump to conclusions about any of this stuff, they published their observations in 1895 of what hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, and nitrogen atoms look like. And this is before anybody had anything, okay? But in particular, what they discovered in looking at this, they discovered what today were called isotopes. So an isotope is for example, hydrogen has a single proton in it, but it has two other isotopes. One involves a single electron with a single proton, but then there's a neutron. So there's two particles that make up the nucleus of deuterium, and then there's a second isotope, tritium, that has two neutrons and one proton and one electron. So that has three. Now, when you look at these things like they did, and they did this for oxygen and for nitrogen, they observed that by and large, hydrogen had a single proton. Oxygen had, let me think, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. Nitrogen had 7 protons, 7 neutrons. But there were a couple of oxygen and nitrogens that had an extra neutron. Not a lot of them, but it was enough so that if I did a weighted combination of this, so I had a bunch that were of weight, say 12, and a very small number that are of weight 13, the actual average weight would be a little greater than 12, might be 12.1, 12.2. And so they discovered that all of these elements with these isotopes ended up leading to different atomic weights than just the pure numbers of the number of protons and the number of electrons. So this led to a classification here where they ended up breaking this thing out. There was the atomic mass of this. The atomic mass was how many protons there are in there. And then there was the actual weighted atomic mass, which would be different than that because of these isotopes. So that was where they started in 1895. And then they went off to Germany and they found a museum in Dresden, had many, many minerals on display. And so they visited with William Crookes, who invented the cathode ray tube that we used to use for television sets or for computer monitors. And he received the Nobel Prize, but he was a member of the London Lodge, the Theosophical Society. So he provided them with specimens of some of these elements that are very difficult to obtain in a pure state. And by 1907, they had examined 59 more elements and come up with all kinds of observations for this, which they then published in November of 1908. So the discovery of these isotopes was really significant. And no one had suspected this because, again, they were just at the stage of thinking about atoms. And here they're talking about pieces of atoms and the nuclei having different numbers of protons and neutrons. Was all too much to chew on. So the end result of this was that no one believed them, of course. But they went ahead and published this. And what happened was that Leadbeater coached Annie Besant in meditation so that he was able to carry out these observations. And so the two of them, not one of them, but two of them would each look at an element they had there. And what they discovered was because they looked at pairs of elements, the pairs of elements, if I took a single proton, for example, from a hydrogen nucleus, it would have 3 quarks in it, and each of those 3 quarks would have 3 subquarks. So there'd be 9 subquarks there. But they always looked at things in pairs. So they always saw 18, not 9 subquarks. And so they ended up, this got to be tricky because they had to count here. So it's fine to start with hydrogen where you have a single proton and you have 9 subquarks or even 18, but 18 is a lot of things. You know, they checked each other out. Did you really get 18? I got 18. And when you start to get up to these higher numbers, 50, 60, 70 protons and comparable numbers of neutrons, you know, you're dealing with hundreds of of these subquarks, and that's what they were seeing. Their colleague, Janarajana Dasa, who was the one who wrote a lot of this stuff up, never got into this meditation, but it is what it is. So again, the key thing to keep in mind is all of their numbers were high by 18 because they were observing these subquarks. So they have always 2 neutrons or protons, 3 quarks for each of them, and then 3 subquarks for each quark. And that gets you the number 18. That's their magic number. This chap, Janarajana, wrote off to this Professor F.W. Aston, who had invented a mass spectrograph. And he told them in 1943, but Besant had died in 1933 and Leadbeater in 1934. So this is in the middle of World War II. He wrote to this Professor Aston and told them about what they'd observed. And he pointed out that they discovered in 1908 that neon 22 had an isotope. Neon 22 is the isotope, which was 4 years before anyone had actually found the element neon. And the first one to find this was Aston in 1912. And so the net of it was that Aston published, he actually had seen this publication in 1908 about neon, which probably suggested to him to do this, build this mass spectrometer so that he could actually measure this stuff. And after 4 years, he confirmed what Leadbeater and Besant had found. So having done all that and having seen it in 1908 in this Theosophical Society, he got the Nobel Prize for coming up with his mass spectrograph. He wrote back and said, well, thanks very much for sending me this communication, and I have to return it without comment. There's no interest in Theosophy. So even though this guy learned all about this, he refused to be associated with it because he'd be viewed as a nut. And so it goes. The thing that happened here, there was a chap in University of Manchester in England. This guy won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1922 for his studies of isotopes. And he gave a scientific paper in 1913, which he labeled as meta-neon. That was, a new form of neon, but it was actually what we would now call an isotope of neon. And he thought it had to be some new element. So that's what he called it. But at the very last page of the paper, he referred to the investigations that were published in 1908 by Besant and Leadbeater. Okay, it's a footnote in the very last page of the paper. And of course, he didn't say anything about this other than he did mention the meta-neon label that they had invented, and he borrowed it in his paper, okay? And he thought that he detected a new element. And the two theosophists, Besant and Leadbeater, really interpreted it to be neon, but with an isotope. And so, the scientist was wrong, and the mystics were right. And so it goes. So Hughes went ahead at the University of Manchester, and he carried out measurements of Besant and Leadbeater, came up with the weighted value of 22.33. Oops, sorry. In 1908, and it's pretty clear that he'd either read or learned about their publications announcing this discovery, but he couldn't tie himself to it. And so here we go with an example of someone not willing to admit this, but getting the Nobel Prize and saying that's it. So what did they do? They would go there together, Mr. Leadbeater and Annie Besant, and we wanted to have our results tested by others. And so this resulted in who else could do this, okay? And they went through all kinds of substances, minerals, etc. And they actually examined 57 chemical elements out of the 78 that were recognized by modern chemistry. And so it goes. So the key thing to keep in mind here is there were other people that were carrying out these observations. And let's just take a look here. Let me skip over this. It's not necessarily. Here's a chap, Edwin Babbitt. So this is in 1878, and he wrote a book called The Principles of Light and Color. Now, irrespective of anything you could think of, here's a sketch of Babbitt. He was actually able to carry out this intense meditation, and he came up with a picture here, which is a picture of a subquark. He did this in 1878, okay? So it isn't just Leadbeater and Besant, and Ron Cowan makes 4 in total. And, having said that, here's what Leadbeater and Besant had come up with. These subquarks are actually made up of 10 closed strings. So here's a picture here, but they have different, what is called chirality. Some are right-handed, and so I take my right hand and I curl my fingers around, my thumb points up. Others are left-handed. I take my fingers and curl them around, my left thumb goes up. So there were mirror images of these 10 strings. So these are probably the strings we know of string theory that are vibrating here, and they carried out incredible observations on these strings that are vibrating like you wouldn't believe. By vibrating, the strings would capture energy, and the energy would be kept inside the vibrating strings, typically in a torus. And then the end result of this is, because there's the concentration of energy is so great, it would appear to be like a particle. So that's why people think of these subquarks as particles, but actually they're vibrating strings with energy resonating inside it. So you could think of the energy as a jelly that's inside here. And so it goes. So there's another guy that, if you take a look in the 1870s and 1880s, John Wilfred Keely. And Keely also had observations of quarks and subquarks. And so we've come up now, in just talking here, with 5 people: Besant and Leadbeater, Babbitt, Ron Cowan, and John Wilfred Keely. If there's 5, there's 500. It's just, the question is, what do you do with this? How many people would know what in the world it is they're looking at, have a framework to talk about this? So one of the things that Besant and Leadbeater did was they made all kinds of sketches of what the nuclei look like. So they have mixes of protons and neutrons, but it isn't just forming into a ball. They found all kinds of shapes, stars, and here's this geometric shape, that geometric shape. Here's some sort of cylinder with a cone on the top. It just goes on and on. That they discovered the actual structure. So they were doing nuclear chemistry back at the turn of the century, and they came up with an idea for carbon. Carbon has 6 protons to it, and with the 6 protons, that means that there's a couple of extra electrons available. What happens here? And the end result was they discovered, this is a picture here showing what they thought benzene looked like, okay? As benzene is a combination of carbon, hydrogen, and that's it. And benzene forms a ring. Here's a ring here that is there. So this is the sort of stuff they were observing. So the work was popularized. The Theosophical Society sent a copy of the 3rd edition of Occult Chemistry to a professor at MIT, and he went and got it, and he was intrigued by it, but we don't know what he ever did with it. It's just an example of getting something out of the blue, and now what do I do? So here we are at the close of the 20th century, going into the start of the 21st century, and there's all kinds of interest now in paranormal activity, in meditation, and so forth. And you know, what is the problem here? Why don't people believe in this? Well, partly it's because there aren't other people that are out there that can replicate these things, but that requires this meditation. And partly it's when they actually do it, they can't believe what they're seeing, or they try and draw pictures, but the pictures are really not that precise, and you can't predict a lot of things from the pictures. So the repeatability is the key thing, and here we've got a lot of people now that have come up with these observations, at least 5 that I'm aware of. Undoubtedly, Nikola Tesla was able to do this sort of stuff, but who knows what was going on there. Another thing to keep in mind is that Leadbeater and Besant did make some mistakes, and Stephen Phillips went through everything they had, and he discovered some errors that they had made in counting these subquarks. But nobody bats 100%. And it was obvious what these mistakes were. They were off by a factor of 18. They'd missed something somewhere, both of them, which shows you when you get up into having tens or even hundreds of these things to look at, it's not out of the question to make a mistake. The key thing, though, is that people like Ron Cowan could replicate everything plus more, and so that's why this work gets disparaged, is because people don't have the ability to meditate at the level that they did, and that's just the ways of the world. But there was a definite structure there that showed that the world around us at every level that we look at has incredible order, and the order appears to be due to these subquarks, and that's what Besant and Leadbeater kept dealing with again and again. You know, having said that, the nature of the science side of things is that they just can't believe that you're doing this, that you simply sit there and meditate. And I posed a whole series of different questions to Ron Cowan, having in mind the framework of the standard model of physics, and he was able to come back with very sharp answers to these things. For example, he was able to see dark matter as well as matter. And so but the difference here is that the dark matter simply consists of these subquarks. They have 5 strings, not 10 strings, 10 closed strings for matter and 5 closed strings for dark matter. So they don't vibrate as much. But these subquarks are what it is. There's no charge, there's no electron for dark matter. And so the dark matter basically forms things that look like ferns that are very rapidly growing, but they're, again, incredibly dense. Remember, most of the mass of the atom is in the nucleus, so this is comparable to that on the same sort of scale. And the end result of this is that each of these things has to have matter and dark matter. When our universe starts up, there has to be something that creates the mass for the particles, and that's called the Higgs boson. And so I asked Ron to take a look, and there are indeed two types of Higgs bosons, one for matter and one for dark matter. And that gives the scaling so that the electron has its mass, the proton and the neutrons have their mass, and so forth, all due to the mass of the Higgs boson for matter. And similarly for dark matter, when that kicks in, there's something that happens. So the thing that happens here is the likelihood of this being a fraud gets to be de minimis. That they really saw something here, that they were accused of fraud, but the observations were so rich and so forth that you couldn't dispute this. Now, what about Annie Besant? She ended up being the actual scientific brains. Remember, Leadbeater was an Anglican priest, and so she ended up learning how to meditate here. And even though she had flunked practical chemistry at the London University, but she wrote all of this. She probably wrote most of the first edition of Occult Chemistry, okay? And she did this in spite of all of these lectures and travel she's doing all across the world and so forth. So it was amazing that she did all this, but this was one of her 26 books and that she wrote in her life. And those are collaborative books, but she had 370 books that she wrote all by herself, including pamphlets and many, many more articles. So she had incredible energy in doing this. The thing to keep in mind here is the website that Stephen Phillips has put together has a wealth of information on this, okay? And here we just touch on this here. Stephen Phillips looked at the occult chemistry work and and concluded that what they were seeing were these subquarks, showing that quarks themselves have structure. But that's it. This is the lowest level of structure that occurs here. But the thing to keep in mind is that there was a review of a scientific paper that Phillips put together from someone over at Princeton, and he said, well, it's invalid mode of argument to accept successes as given and explain away failures by invoking new phenomena for which there's no positive evidence. So one can support any theory whatsoever. Well, so maybe the theory that Phillips has proposed here is not the right theory, okay? He's not saying that. He is saying that what Leadbeater and Besant did was spot on and was in advance of a lot of other measurements that were done since then. And there were other people here that were involved in the Theosophical Society besides Crookes, who got the Nobel Prize for his work with the cathode ray tube. There were many more. They were all involved in what we call psychic research. So there's a lot of activity in London with hypnotism and with mesmerism and so forth at the 1880s, 1890s. Stephen Phillips, in the late 70s, when he was finishing up his graduate work in high energy physics, he came across this book, and he went through and tested everything, every which way that he could think of. And the end result of all this was that Phillips was completely convinced that they were right on, modulo the errors that he spotted in doing this. The thing to keep in mind here is, for example, Leadbeater and Besant took a look at these strings, and these strings are actually, they themselves have little curlicues around them. There's so many spirals per unit length here in this. And they ended up talking about major whorls, which are the things you see here, and the rest, the other 7 that are minor whorls. Each of these whorls makes 5 revolutions around this string, and it vibrates, and this end up again creating the resonant energy inside it that lead to everything happening. Here's what, let me get this out of the way here. Here's what Babbitt saw. Here's what Leadbeater and Besant saw. Probably close enough for government work. No one knew anything. John Wilfred Keeley, there's indication that he saw the same thing. Babbitt didn't really think about these things as being fundamental. He thought that these were atoms, and he didn't realize that they made up pieces of the atom. But so it goes. There's a whole bunch of animations out there on how these things look, how the strings bounce around and so forth. And Phillips carried out a graph here. He tried to test this. So here's a straight line going with the mass on here and the number of subquarks going up here. And you can see it gets up into the thousands. They got up to in the range of 2,000 here, which is what led to it. But the straight line is fit with a slope of 18. That's what they can continually saw, 18 subquarks for every 2 nuclei of an atom. Of course, no one wants to hear this. They can't believe that you could do this with just paper and pencil. Phillips fitted this stuff to a bunch of different curves shown here. And there was 23 elements that they discovered that only had one isotope. Beryllium, fluoride, sodium, aluminum, phosphorus, etc. And having said that, these are pure. There's no isotopes. The fit here is that they have 18 subquarks for each proton or neutron that's in the nucleus, and that was confirmed. The work that they did was phenomenally detailed, and the thing I just touched on was the strings having little curlicues in it. It turns out that those curlicues themselves have curlicues, and it appears that they go down 7 levels. So to sit there and you can see that they're doing more than just observing this. They're able to stop these things from vibrating. So there's a physical capability to stop the vibration. How could you draw anything of this thing that was vibrating at millions, hundreds of millions of times per second? And then the other thing that happens is they could look at the strings themselves and see that each of the strings is made up of curlicues, and each of the curlicues made up of curlicues going down 7 levels. Truly an amazing accomplishment. So what did we get out of this? this is from Phillips. You get some idea. So with this, what Leadbeater and Besant did, their observations using what they called micro-psi or clairvoyance in 1895, they came up with positive and negative hydrogen triplets that they observed in atoms. But modern physics took till 1964 to come up with quarks and realized that protons and neutrons were each made up of quarks. So there's a gap here of 69 years. In 1908, they came up with these publications on these different sorts of isotopes here. In 1912, there was this discovery of this isotope of neon. And then in 1933, there were other discussions here of looking for magnetic monopoles, which no one has as yet found. I know Ron Cowan, I asked him about that, and he couldn't find any. I asked him about gravitons and gravitinos, and he'd seen some things like this, but they were very rare. So something has to be changed in any of these theories. But in the 1960s, going into the 1970s, this string theory became very popular for what made up quarks, or in fact, what makes up subquarks. And that appears to be carrying the day. For the one problem is there's no observations. The observations are all done by people doing clairvoyant observations. There were more observations, for example, in 1909 for other elements here that apparently were confused with. There's something that Leadbeater and Besant called the linium, and it turns out that it's probably promethium when they looked at this. And the other one was technetium, and they came up with something else here. So, it's an example. They don't bat 100%, but these weights are close enough that they show there's something going on. There was the notion of these particles having spin, of rotating around, spinning at a very high rate inside the nucleus and so forth. And but Leadbeater and Besant had also come up with that idea. And then in 1932, they came up with some other elements, which in fact in 1940, 1939 were actually confirmed. They just didn't know what they were. So what are the main reasons why these claims appear to be genuine? Well, the first thing is that the subquark numbers more accurately match the mass numbers of all these nucleides than the chemical atomic weights. So they're not concocted from atomic weights. They're from straight observations. And it took more than 25 years for people to realize this. Furthermore, they reported different versions of these subquarks years before isotopes were conceived and detected. And they continued to point these things out along the way. So these different elements, technetium, promethium, astatine, francium, were all detected by Leadbeater and Besant, decades before they were discovered by modern Western science. The lines force that are binding these subquarks together matches what you would see in what's called quantum chromodynamics or string theory, with modulo all the issues that go with that. The level of the quantitative and the qualitative correlation in the facts of modern nuclear physics that have been experimentally established are just too high for this to be a fluke, a coincidence. There's just too many things here that line up. The subquarks are really consistent with closed strings, which is one of the theoretical string theories. And then there's 6 higher orders of circular spiruli. So the as I mentioned, there's little curlicues here, and there are 6 orders of them going around. You look at the string, and the string has little curlicues. You look at the curlicues, that has little curlicues. You have to go down 6 times to find out, to get down to the bottom of what's going on. And 6 appears to be the magic number that we saw that Ron came up with for these compactified subspaces that string theory deals with. So these are really the main reasons. There's lots of other little reasons why what they observed was genuine, but this is huge. Here's an example of these spirals, so you can see. Here's a string, and it's got little curlicues. You take it apart, take that apart, take that apart, and so on. You got all the way down to where they just call them bubbles here. Truly mind-boggling. And then there's a lot of other observations that Leadbeater and Besant did, showing, for example, there's a higher order here, of 100 of every 25th order spiruli ties into 176 times n+1 order spiruli, and so forth, for the major whorls and for the minor whorls. So this has to be something that would be included in string theory in terms of what's going on. And it's something that, should be pursued here, but it's based on evidence, observations that are happening here. So with that, we're going to stop. We're done. Yeah, we are. And there you have it. This is what intrigued me to get into this. That's how I met Ron. That's how I met Bruce. And it was an exciting journey, going through all this stuff. And of course, Ron's earlier incarnation was as Emmy Noether. So we had all these 3-way conversations with Ron and me and Emmy on what was being observed and what we should be looking for. And Emmy was very forthcoming and look at this and look at that and so forth. So most appreciated, which is, of course, all due to Ron. Bruce, any color you want to add? Any comments?
Well, I think one of the things that Ron was mostly amazed at, and how he described that he was observing an electron traveling, and it would suddenly disappear and then reappear a little bit further on. And he realized that that's when the electron expanded forever, or for infinite amount, and made observations and came back and recorded them on little bars that were inside the electron. He
had with this double slit experiment where you shot electrons at a slit, but if there are 2 slits, the electron was coated with these blocks of information.
Right.
So it was scanning all the time, and I have no idea where those scans occur. There's some other energy field out there that is generating these scans that holds everything together. And the electron detected this and would immediately expand and turn it into a wave instead of being a particle. And then the wave would go through the 2 slits. When you ask any physicist, and they're all aware it's 100 years old, this double slit experiment. But Ron was the first one I came across that could explain it.
Right. I also like to point out that, he had this vast capability of meditating into subatomic particles, but he also had the ability to observe the mind. And he was able to observe what happens in a previous lifetime. He could put together what happened in a previous lifetime and what the effects were in the current lifetime. And so this kind of touches into basic understanding in terms of Buddhist terms into karma and things like that.
Yeah,
So
sure.
his abilities were only in the physical world, but also in the mental world, which is much more interesting for me.
Yeah,
But he was very inspired by this atom that expanded and then came back.
absolutely. Sure.
Uh,
You should be. I mean, it's amazing. This is really a work of art when you look at what he was observing and you see this order and the incredible structure, all of these wave patterns and resonances, and it's incredibly beautiful. He always said that it was very noisy, that when you listen to these atoms and nuclei all banging around, I mean, the noise level is out of sight. And that was where he would reach out and just kind of clamp down on it. I
right.
have no idea how you could stop a subquark from bouncing around, but he did it, and then things were quiet.
Yeah. Well, it's the kind of ability that you have on the inner. But one of the things I like to point out is that in this kind of deeper meditation, is that like he's able to bore down and to see these observations very specifically and make drawings of them. But also, like I'd like to point out that along with that comes this incredible experience of nonverbal understanding about a whole lot of things, and all at the same time.
Yeah,
So
he always mentioned that, and
yeah,
it was there was a richness to the
yeah,
observation that the
it's
sketch
incredible.
couldn't
Yeah,
begin
yeah,
to.
yeah. Like there's when you do that kind of observation, it opens up doors of understanding on the nonverbal level
Right.
that go forever. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and to me, it was amazing that Leadbeater and Besant never saw dark matter, even though dark matter is far more prevalent in terms of mass
Right.
than matter is. Okay, they just never observed it. They had their own way of doing these observations, and what they did was phenomenal. But they missed most of the mass and
Yeah.
energy in the universe. You know,
Yeah. So
but Ron saw it all.
yeah.
He was right on it.
So what we need is about 10 more meditators who can
Yeah,
duplicate what Ron did.
yeah. Well, it ought to be just part of education. You ought to be able to. It's like I always tell people that you learn to play basketball, but not everybody's Michael Jordan. You know,
Yeah.
but you can still do a perfectly good job and enjoy playing basketball.
Yeah. But in terms of Buddhism, for instance, both Ron and I shared a guru, Namja Rinpoche, and his mind had all these kind of experiences normally, and he would share some of them, more about spiritual things
Sure,
the
that was
outer.
what
Yeah,
interested me. Yeah,
and it goes forever. I mean, this is one of the main things that's missing in the West is what happens when you meditate a lot. You start having these major breakthroughs,
right,
and
right, and
changes everything. You live in a different world altogether.
yeah. Yeah, and Ron did spend some time sharing with me what he observed and going out into space and what in between galaxies and so forth, and that was truly amazing. But we had to focus on what we could do, and right now most of our knowledge is focused on the atom and the
Right.
structure of the atom, and we're just getting the telescopes now to be able to look out into space and see these other things. But we're gonna need millennia
Yeah.
to see what Ron saw. It's
Well, they're
it's
out there. I mean, there's Well, my own teacher, Nam Rinpoche, was a good example of it. Like he had these amazing direct insights into the mind, very similar to Ron's observations into the atom.
Sure.
And anyway,
Well, Ron, yeah, I mean, for example, Ron, when he was talking about dark matter, he said, well, it requires, typically some sort of thermal energy to shake it so that it becomes more active, but it's got some basic sentience to it. There's some sentient material there, and that what he observed was when it's not active, that it's floating around in space, for example, and you end up with, he talked about tubes that were, hundreds of kilometers long that are made up of dark matter that are just floating around, that just have glommed onto one another, and they're floating there, and at some point they'll land in a star or on a planet somewhere, and they'll get much more active. But it's what's out in the universe. Or he saw there were these compartments of space that actually got stretched light years. Okay, there was something inside them, and he would see these strings. They were the width of a space compartment, which is infinitesmal in its width, and they would go for light years. There'd be some sort of energy inside the space compartment that would have pulled it, stretched it, several light years, and it goes on and on. And you just start to realize how little you know. When you're seeing this, that there's orders on occur at all levels, and it's very hard.
Yeah, you have to keep in mind also that it wasn't just the electrons that expanded. Everything expands.
Right.
All material aspects and all expand and see the universe, and then come back and record it. That's everywhere. It's in everything.
Yeah, it's every, and that's why everything is synchronized. That's why everything works, is because everything is interacting with everything else. So that's what I told Marjorie. That's why the astrology works, is because those planets really are influencing you. They're sentient. You might not believe it, but so it goes. So anyway.
Alrighty.
Have a great weekend, and we'll catch you next week, and keep you posted on everything.
Okay.
Have a good. Bye-bye.
Bye.